Two pregnant mother bears. Locked in a cage, what this baby did was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The morning mist hung thick over Pine Ridge Valley like a gray blanket that refused to lift. 19-month-old Luna Hayes pressed her tiny palms against the cold window of the cabin, her breath creating small clouds on the glass. Outside, the world looked different today. The trees seemed to whisper secrets she couldn't understand, and somewhere in the distance, a sound drifted through the air that made her tilt her head with curiosity. Her mother, Iris Hayes, was busy in the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee mixing with the aroma of pancakes on the griddle. The radio played softly in the background, but Luna wasn't paying attention to the cheerful morning show. Something else had captured her attention entirely. There it was again. A low, mournful sound that seemed to come from the woods behind their cabin. Luna's bright blue eyes widened as she listened. It wasn't like the birds she was used to hearing, or even the deer that sometimes wandered through their yard. This was different. This was sadness wrapped in sound. "Mama," Luna called out in her sweet, small voice, but Iris was humming along to the radio, lost in her morning routine. The sound came again, longer this time, and Luna felt something strange in her chest. It was like when she saw the broken bird last week, the one with the hurt wing that made her want to cry. But this feeling was bigger, stronger. Her little heart began to beat faster, and without really understanding why, she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Luna looked back at her mother, who was now flipping pancakes with practiced ease. Steam rose from the pan, and everything in the kitchen looked warm and safe. But outside, something was calling to her. Something that needed help. The toddler pressed her face against the window again, trying to see through the thick mist. The sound came once more, and this time it was joined by another voice. Two voices, both filled with the same deep sadness that made Luna's little chest feel tight. She didn't know what bears were, not really. She'd seen pictures in her books. Big, fluffy animals that looked like her teddy bear, Mr. Brown. But these sounds didn't match the happy pictures. These sounds spoke of something terrible. Something that made her want to reach out with her small hands and make it better. "Mama, sad," Luna whispered, her breath fogging the window again. But Iris was now talking on the phone to Luna's grandmother, discussing plans for the weekend, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in her daughter's young heart. The mist began to shift slightly, and Luna caught a glimpse of something metal glinting through the trees. It was far away, barely visible, but it was there. Something that didn't belong in the forest of soft greens and browns. Something cold and hard and wrong. Luna stepped back from the window, her tiny hands clenched into fists. She looked at her mother again, then back at the window. The sounds had stopped for now, but she knew they would come back. They had to come back, because whatever was making them wasn't okay. And Luna, despite being so small that she still needed help reaching the cookies on the counter, felt with absolute certainty that she had to do something about it. The kitchen suddenly felt too warm, too bright, too far away from whatever was happening in those woods. Luna's bare feet made soft pattering sounds on the wooden floor as she moved toward the back door. Her hand barely reached the handle, but she knew how to turn it. She'd done it before when chasing butterflies in the yard. "Mama," she called one more time, but the phone conversation continued, filled with laughter and plans, and normal things that suddenly seemed very far away from what Luna was feeling. The door handle turned easily in her small grip, and cool morning air rushed in to greet her. The mist swirled around her ankles as she stepped onto the back porch, and immediately the sounds became clearer. Not just sadness now, but something else. Fear. Deep, desperate fear that made Luna's eyes fill with tears she didn't understand. She clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit, Coco, tighter to her chest. Coco had been with her through everything scary. Thunderstorms, doctor visits, the time she got lost in the grocery store. If she was going to help whatever was making those terrible sounds, she would need Coco with her. The backyard stretched out before her with its familiar swing set and sandbox, but today it looked different. Today it looked like the beginning of a path that led to something important. Something that a 19-month-old girl with a heart too big for her tiny body absolutely had to discover. Luna took her first step into the misty morning, Coco tucked safely under one arm, her other hand wiping away tears that kept coming no matter how hard she tried to stop them. Behind her, the warm kitchen continued its normal morning routine, but ahead of her, something waited in the shadows of the pine trees. Something that would change everything she thought she knew about the world. The sounds came again, closer now, and Luna felt her little legs moving faster, carrying her toward whatever was calling to her through the mist. She didn't know about danger. She didn't know about the things that could hurt little girls who wandered too far from home. All she knew was that something needed her. That was enough to make her brave. The pine needles beneath her tiny feet were wet with dew, making each step slippery and uncertain. Luna stumbled once, catching herself with one hand while keeping Coco safe with the other. The stuffed rabbit's soft fur was already damp from the mist, but Luna held on, tighter. Coco was her courage, her companion in this strange journey that felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary. As she walked deeper into the trees, the familiar sounds of home began to fade behind her. No more radio playing softly, no more sizzling pancakes, no more of her mother's gentle humming. Instead, the forest wrapped around her with its own music of dripping leaves and distant bird calls. But underneath it all, those other sounds continued to pull at her heart. Luna paused by a large pine tree, its bark rough against her small palm as she steadied herself. From here, she could see the metal glinting more clearly through the mist. It wasn't just one piece of metal, she realized with the sharp observation that only children possess. It was many pieces, connected together, forming something that looked like the dog kennels she'd seen at the pet store, but much bigger, much sadder. Her breath came in small puffs as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The structure sat in a small clearing about 50 yards ahead, and even from this distance she could see movement inside it. Large, dark shapes that shifted and swayed with an exhaustion that Luna could feel in her own small bones. Then the wind changed direction, and with it came a scent that made Luna's nose wrinkle. It wasn't the clean smell of pine and morning dew that she was used to. This was heavier, mustier, mixed with something that reminded her of the time their neighbor's cat had been sick. Fear sent, though Luna didn't have words for what she was recognizing. She took another step forward, then another, her curiosity now stronger than any instinct to turn back. Coco bounced gently against her side with each step, a comforting rhythm that kept her feet moving even as her heart began to beat faster. The mist was starting to thin as the sun climbed higher, and Luna could make out more details of the strange metal structure ahead. There were bars, thick and close together, just like the pictures of zoos in her books. But this didn't look like the clean, bright zoos from her picture books. This looked forgotten, neglected, wrong. Another sound reached her ears, different from the mournful calls she'd been following. This was lower, more guttural, followed by what sounded almost like a sob. Luna's steps faltered as she realized, with the intuitive understanding that children sometimes possess, that she was hearing crying. Real, desperate crying from something that was hurt and afraid and alone. Her own eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't try to wipe them away. Instead, she clutched Coco closer and whispered to her stuffed companion in the way she did when she was scared but trying to be brave. "It's okay, Coco. We help sad." The clearing was closer now, maybe 30 yards away, and Luna could see that there were actually 2 large shapes inside the metal cage. They were pressed close together, and every few minutes one would lift its head and make that heartbreaking sound that had first called to her through the window. But there was something else in the clearing too, something that made Luna stop behind a cluster of young trees and peer through the branches with suddenly cautious eyes. There were people there. 3 men standing near the cage, but they weren't helping. They weren't trying to make the sad sound stop. Instead, they were laughing. Luna didn't understand the words they were saying, but she understood laughter. And this wasn't the kind of laughter that meant happy things. This was the kind of laughter that made her feel cold inside, the way she felt when older kids at the park were mean to smaller children. One of the men kicked at the metal bars, and the sound rang out sharp and cruel through the morning air. The shapes inside the cage pressed even closer together, and Luna heard a new sound now. A protective growling that seemed to come from deep within whatever was trapped inside. Luna's small hands tightened on Coco's fur as she watched, her young mind trying to process what she was seeing. The men were wearing clothes that looked dirty and rough, and their voices carried an edge that made her want to hide. But the things in the cage, the things making those heartbroken sounds, they weren't scary at all. They were hurt. They were afraid. They were asking for help in the only way they knew how. And suddenly, Luna understood something that would have been impossible to explain to any adult. She understood that sometimes the things that look scary on the outside are really just scared on the inside. And sometimes the things that look normal on the outside, like these men with their human faces and human voices, are the truly frightening ones. The realization made her stomach feel fluttery and strange, but it also made something else stir inside her small chest. Something fierce and protective that she'd never felt before. These men were being mean to something that couldn't fight back, something that was already hurt and trapped and afraid. Luna looked down at Coco, whose button eyes seemed to look back at her with understanding. She had to do something. She didn't know what exactly, but she had to try. Because sometimes, when you're small and the world is big and scary, being small is actually the most important thing you can be. The men were moving away from the cage now, walking toward a beaten-up truck parked at the edge of the clearing. Their voices carried on the morning air, talking about things Luna couldn't understand, using words that sounded harsh and wrong. But as they moved away, the sounds from the cage became clearer, more desperate. Luna crept closer, using the trees and bushes as cover the way she did when playing hide-and-seek with her mother. Each step brought her nearer to understanding what exactly was trapped in that terrible metal prison, and with each step her determination grew stronger. Whatever was in there needed her. She could feel it with the same certainty that told her when rain was coming, or when Coco needed an extra hug at bedtime. And Luna Hayes, all 19 months of her, was not going to let them down. The morning mist continued to lift around her as she made her way toward the clearing, toward whatever waited inside that cage, toward a discovery that would change not just her own life, but the lives of creatures she hadn't even met yet. Behind her, the warm safety of home seemed like something from a dream, and ahead of her the real world waited with all its beauty and all its terror. But Luna walked forward anyway, because sometimes being brave isn't about not being scared. Sometimes being brave is about being scared and walking forward anyway, with nothing but a stuffed rabbit and a heart too big for such a small body to carry. The men's voices grew fainter as they reached their truck, but Luna could still hear them talking in those harsh tones that made her skin prickle. She crept from tree to tree, her small form easily hidden behind the thick pine trunks, until she was close enough to see clearly into the cage. What she saw made her gasp so sharply that she had to press her hand over her mouth to keep from making noise. Inside the metal prison were two of the most magnificent creatures she had ever seen, but they looked nothing like the happy, fluffy bears from her picture books. These bears were huge, with thick, dark fur that should have been beautiful but was now matted and dirty. But what made Luna's heart break into a million pieces was seeing how big their bellies were, round and swollen in a way that reminded her of Mrs. Peterson next door when she was expecting her baby. These bears were going to be mamas, just like Mrs. Peterson had been, and they were trapped. One of the bears was lying on her side, her massive body taking up most of the small cage. Her breathing was labored, and every few breaths she would let out a soft whimper that sounded exactly like crying. The other bear was trying to comfort her, nuzzling her gently with her enormous head, but there was barely enough room for both of them to move. Luna's eyes filled with tears as she watched the second bear trying to find a comfortable position. Every time she shifted, the metal bars scraped against her fur, and Luna could see patches where the hair had been worn away from constant rubbing against the cruel cage. The bear's eyes, when Luna caught sight of them, were the saddest things she had ever seen. But there was something else in those eyes too, something that made Luna's breath catch in her throat. Intelligence. These weren't just big animals making noise. These were mothers, thinking and feeling and suffering in ways that Luna could somehow understand even though she was barely old enough to form complete sentences. The truck's engine roared to life, and Luna ducked lower behind her tree as the men drove away, their laughter fading with the sound of the motor. But they weren't. Gone for good, she somehow knew. They would be back, and whatever they had planned for these poor mama bears, it wasn't anything good. Silence settled over the clearing like a heavy blanket, broken only by the labored breathing from the cage and the occasional soft whimper. Luna waited several minutes, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the bears could hear it, before she finally stepped out from behind the tree. The moment she appeared in the clearing, both bears' heads snapped up, their dark eyes focusing on her with startling intensity. Luna froze, suddenly very aware of how small she was, how far from home, how alone. Coco felt tiny and inadequate in her arms as she faced these massive creatures. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of growling or showing their teeth the way Luna thought wild animals were supposed to do, both bears went completely still. They watched her with what looked almost like curiosity, their heads tilted slightly as if they were trying to figure out what this tiny human child was doing in their forest. Luna took a tentative step forward, then another. With each step, she expected the bears to react with fear or anger, but they didn't. They just watched her, and in their eyes she saw something that made her own fear begin to melt away. She saw recognition. Not the kind of recognition that comes from having met before, but the deeper kind that comes from recognizing something fundamental about another being. They were mothers. She was a child. And in that moment, some ancient understanding passed between them that had nothing to do with species or size, or the fact that they were separated by metal bars. "Hi," Luna whispered, her voice barely audible even in the quiet clearing. "Hi, Mama Bears." The bear, who had been lying down, struggled to lift her head higher, her movement slow and obviously painful. But she managed it, and when she looked at Luna, her expression was so gentle that Luna felt her last bit of fear disappear entirely. Luna walked closer to the cage, close enough now to see the details that made her heart ache even more. The bears' water bowl was empty and dirty. Their food, what little there was of it, looked old and moldy. Flies buzzed around the cage, and the smell of waste and sickness was stronger here. But worst of all was seeing how the pregnant bears were trying to protect their unborn babies even in these horrible conditions. The way they positioned themselves, the way they moved so carefully despite their obvious discomfort, the way they watched Luna with eyes that seemed to be pleading for help, not just for themselves, but for the little ones they carried. Luna reached into her pocket and pulled out the small granola bar she had grabbed from the kitchen counter while her mother wasn't looking. It was squished and probably not very tasty, but it was food, and these mama bears looked so hungry. She broke the granola bar in half and pushed one piece through the bars. The nearest bear sniffed it carefully, then took it with a gentleness that amazed Luna. Despite being so big and obviously so hungry, the bear was incredibly careful not to accidentally hurt Luna's tiny fingers. The second piece went to the other bear, who accepted it with the same careful grace. Luna watched as they ate the small offering, and she wished desperately that she had brought more food, more water, more of everything these poor creatures needed. But as she stood there, trying to figure out what else she could do to help, Luna heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of a truck engine coming back up the dirt road toward the clearing. The men were returning, and they were coming fast. Luna looked around frantically, her mind racing with possibilities. She could hide behind the trees again, but what would happen to the mama bears when the men came back? She could run home and try to tell her mother, but who would believe such an incredible story from a 19-month-old child who could barely speak in full sentences? But then Luna noticed something she hadn't seen before. Near the base of the cage, partially hidden by tall grass, was a set of keys. Heavy, metal keys that had probably fallen from one of the men's pockets or belt loops. Keys that might, just might, open the lock that kept these beautiful creatures imprisoned. The truck sound was getting closer, and Luna knew she had to make a decision quickly. She could play it safe, hide in the trees, and hope that somehow, someday, someone else would help these bears. Or she could do something that might be dangerous, but might also be the only chance these mothers and their unborn babies would ever have. Luna looked at the keys, then at the bears, then at Coco clutched tightly in her arms. The stuffed rabbit seemed to look back at her with button eyes that said, "You know what you have to do." And Luna did know. She knew with the absolute certainty that sometimes comes to children when they're faced with something that's simply right or wrong, with no complicated gray areas in between. She dove for the keys just as the truck's headlights became visible through the trees. Her small fingers closed around the cold metal, and she scrambled toward the cage lock as fast as her tiny legs could carry her. The first key didn't fit. Neither did the second. Luna's hands were shaking now, and she could hear the truck getting closer, the sound of male voices carried on the morning air. The third key slipped from her trembling fingers and fell to the ground with a small clink that sounded as loud as thunder to her terrified ears. But the fourth key slid into the lock like it was meant to be there. Luna turned it with all her strength, and the lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire forest. For a moment, nobody moved. Not Luna, not the bears, not even the birds in the trees seemed to breathe. Then the truck rounded the final bend, its headlights sweeping across the clearing, and everything changed at once. The men saw the open cage door at the exact same moment that the bears realized they were free. Luna found herself caught in the middle of chaos she couldn't have imagined, with two massive pregnant bears rising to their feet for the first time in who knew how long, their eyes blazing with a mixture of hope and fury that made the very air around them seem to crackle with energy. And in that moment, as the truck doors slammed and angry voices began shouting, Luna realized that opening the cage had been only the beginning. The real adventure, the real danger, and the real test of what a tiny girl with a huge heart could accomplish was just about to begin. The first bear, the one who had been lying down, rose to her feet with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large and obviously in pain. She was enormous, easily 8 feet tall when she stood on her hind legs, her dark fur rippling with muscles that spoke of incredible strength. But what struck Luna most was the look in her eyes as she gazed down at the tiny child who had freed her. There was no anger there, no wildness. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like gratitude, mixed with a fierce determination that made the air around her seem to shimmer with power. The second bear moved more slowly, her pregnancy making every movement careful and deliberate. But when she stood, she positioned herself slightly in front of Luna, as if protecting the small girl who had given them their freedom. The gesture was so human, so motherly, that Luna felt tears spring to her eyes again. What the hell? The voice that cut through the morning air was harsh and filled with rage. "Jake, the cage is open. The bears are out." 3 men emerged from the truck, and Luna could see their faces clearly for the first time. They looked nothing like the friendly adults she was used to seeing at the grocery store or the playground. These faces were hard and cruel, with eyes that reminded her of the mean dogs that sometimes growled at her through chain-link fences. The man in front, apparently Jake, was tall and thin, with scruffy facial hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. Behind him came 2 others, one short and stocky with missing teeth, the other wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. All 3 carried themselves with the swagger of people who were used to being mean and getting away with it. "How did they get out?" the short one demanded, his voice high and panicky. "We locked that cage ourselves." Jake's eyes swept the clearing and landed on Luna, standing there with Coco clutched in her arms, still holding the keys in her small fist. For a moment, his expression was so surprised that he looked almost comical. Then his face darkened with an anger that made Luna's knees feel weak. "A kid," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "A damn kid let them out." Luna wanted to run. Every instinct in her tiny body screamed at her to turn around and race back through the trees toward home, toward safety, toward her mother's warm kitchen and the smell of pancakes. But she couldn't move. Her legs felt frozen to the ground, and Coco seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in her arms. The bears, however, were not frozen at all. The moment they saw the men, both of them underwent a transformation that was terrifying and magnificent at the same time. Their lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were longer and sharper than Luna had imagined possible. Deep growls rumbled from their chests, sounds that seemed to come from the very earth itself, but they didn't attack. Despite their obvious fury, despite the terrible things these men had done to them, the bears held their ground protectively around Luna. It was as if they understood that she was the reason they were free, and they would not let anything happen to her. "Back off!" Jake shouted, pulling something from his belt that made Luna's blood run cold. It was long and black and looked like the thing her father kept locked in the safe at home. "Back off, or I'll shoot!" The bears' growls deepened, and Luna could feel the vibration of their anger through the ground beneath her feet. But still, they didn't move away from her. If anything, they pressed closer, creating a wall of fur and muscle between Luna and the men with their cruel faces and dangerous intentions. "You can't shoot them, you idiot," the man in the baseball cap hissed. "They're worth more alive. Do you know how much money we're going to lose if you kill them?" Luna didn't understand what they meant by worth money, But she understood enough to know that these men had taken the mama bears away from their home, locked them in that horrible cage, and were planning to do something even worse to them. The realization made her feel sick and angry in a way she had never experienced before. "Then what do you suggest?" Jake snarled, his weapon still pointed at the bears. "They're free now, and they're protecting that kid like she's one of their cubs. We can't get close enough to tranquilize them, and we sure as hell can't leave them loose." The shortest man was pacing back and forth, his hands pulling at his hair in frustration. "The buyer is expecting them tomorrow. Tomorrow, Jake. If we don't deliver, we're dead. You know what happens to people who disappoint him." Luna's mind was working as fast as it could, trying to piece together what she was hearing. Someone wanted to buy the mama bears. Someone bad enough that these mean men were afraid of him. And tomorrow was when they were supposed to hand over these beautiful, gentle creatures to whatever terrible fate awaited them. But as she stood there, protected by two pregnant bears who had every reason to hate humans but had chosen to protect her instead, Luna felt something new stirring in her chest. It wasn't fear anymore, though she was still scared. It wasn't just sadness, though her heart still ached for what these creatures had endured. It was anger, pure, righteous anger that burned in her small body like a fire. These men had hurt her new friends. They had locked them up, starved them, frightened them, and planned to sell them like toys or furniture. And that was wrong. It was so wrong that Luna could feel the wrongness of it in every cell of her body. "Hey," she said, her voice small but surprisingly clear in the tense air of the clearing. All three men turned to stare at her, as if they had forgotten she could speak. Even the bears seemed surprised, their massive heads turning to look down at her with curious expressions. "Hey," Luna said again, louder this time. "You're being mean." Jake laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Mean? Kid, you don't know what mean is, but you're about to find out if you don't get those bears back in that cage right now." Luna looked up at the bears, who were watching her with those intelligent, soulful eyes. Then she looked back at the men with their hard faces and cruel intentions. And then she did something that no one in that clearing expected. She smiled. It wasn't a happy smile exactly. It was the kind of smile that appeared on her face when she was about to do something she knew would get her in trouble, but she was going to do it anyway because it was the right thing to do. "No," Luna said simply. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Jake's face went red with fury, and he took a step forward, raising his weapon higher. But as he did, something extraordinary happened. The first bear, the larger one, suddenly reared up on her hind legs to her full height. Standing like that, she was easily 10 feet tall, a mountain of fur and muscle and maternal fury that blocked out the morning sun. Her roar, when it came, was unlike anything Luna had ever heard. It was the sound of thunder and avalanches and every force of nature that could not be stopped or controlled. But she wasn't roaring at Luna. She was roaring at Jake, and the message was crystal clear even without words. "Touch the child, and you will deal with me." The second bear, despite her pregnancy, moved to flank the men, cutting off their escape route back to the truck. Her movements were slow but deliberate, and Luna realized with amazement that these bears were working together, planning their next moves like the intelligent creatures they were. Jake's hands were shaking now, and the weapon wavered in his grip. "This is impossible," he muttered. "Bears don't act like this. They don't protect human kids. They don't cooperate. What the hell is wrong with them?" But Luna knew what was wrong with them. Nothing was wrong with them. Everything was right with them. They were mothers, protecting someone they saw as innocent and helpless. They were creatures who had been shown kindness by a small child, and were returning that kindness the only way they knew how. "We need to call the boss," the man in the baseball cap said, his voice, tight with panic. "Tell him we have a situation. Maybe he'll know what to do." Jake pulled out a cell phone with his free hand, never taking his eyes off the bears. But as he started to dial, Luna heard something that made her heart leap with hope and terror at the same time. Her mother's voice, distant but growing closer, calling her name through the forest. "Luna, Luna, where are you?" Iris had discovered her daughter was missing. She was coming, probably following the same path Luna had taken, drawn by the same mysterious sounds that had first called to Luna through the cabin window. The men heard it too, and Jake's face went pale. "There's someone else coming," he hissed. "We need to get out of here now." But the bears had different ideas. At the sound of Luna's mother's voice, both of them moved closer to Luna, forming an even tighter protective circle around her. It was as if they understood that this voice belonged to Luna's mother, and they were determined to keep the child safe until her own parent could arrive. Luna's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but for the first time since this whole adventure began, she felt something like hope. Her mother was coming. The mama bears were protecting her, and these mean men were starting to look scared instead of angry. Maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. But as Jake finished dialing his phone and started speaking in urgent, frightened whispers to whoever answered, Luna realized that their troubles were far from over. The person on the other end of that phone call, the buyer who was expecting the bears tomorrow, was about to learn that his plans had been disrupted by a 19-month-old girl with a stuffed rabbit and a heart full of courage. And something told Luna that he was not going to be happy about it at all. Jake's voice dropped to an urgent whisper as he spoke into the phone, but in the morning stillness, Luna could catch fragments of his conversation. Words like complications and the kid and might need cleanup crew that made her stomach feel cold and twisty, even though she didn't fully understand what they meant. The bears seemed to sense the shift in tension, too. The larger female lowered herself back to all fours, but kept her massive body positioned between Luna and the men, while the pregnant bear began making soft huffing sounds that Luna somehow understood were meant to comfort her. It was like having two enormous, furry bodyguards who had appointed themselves her protectors. "Luna, Luna, baby, where are you?" Iris's voice was closer now, maybe only a few hundred yards away, but she was clearly struggling through the thick underbrush. Luna could hear branches snapping, and her mother's frustrated muttering as she tried to follow whatever trail her daughter had left. Luna wanted desperately to call out to her mother, to let her know where she was, but something held her back. Maybe it was the way Jake kept glancing in the direction of her, mother's voice with those cold, calculating eyes. Maybe it was the way the shorter man had started moving toward the trees, as if planning to intercept Iris before she could reach the clearing. Or maybe it was the growing certainty that calling out would only put her mother in the same danger that Luna now found herself in. Jake ended his phone call and slipped the device back into his pocket, his face grim. "Change of plans," he announced to his companions. "The boss says we handle this ourselves. No witnesses, no complications, no loose ends." The way he said "no loose ends" made Luna's skin prickle with fear. She didn't know exactly what he meant, but she understood enough to know that it wasn't good. Not good at all. "What about the bears?" asked the man in the baseball cap, gesturing nervously at the massive animals who were still maintaining their protective stance around Luna. "We trank them here, load them up, and stick to the original timeline," Jake replied, pulling a different kind of weapon from his belt. This one looked like a gun too, but it was fatter and had a long, thin dart sticking out the end. "As for the kid and whoever's coming to find her—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the look in his eyes finished it for him. Luna felt her knees start to shake, and she pressed Coco closer to her chest, drawing what comfort she could from the familiar softness of her stuffed friend. But then something remarkable happened. The larger bear, who had been watching this exchange with those intelligent dark eyes, suddenly made a sound that Luna had never heard before. It wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a moan. It was something entirely different, something that seemed to carry meaning in a way that transcended species. The pregnant bear responded immediately, making a similar sound, and then both bears were moving with a coordination that took Luna's breath away. The larger one began circling to the left while the pregnant one moved right, and suddenly the three men found themselves being herded like sheep, pushed steadily away from Luna and toward the far edge of the clearing. "What are they doing?" the short man yelped, stumbling backward as the pregnant bear advanced on him with surprising speed despite her condition. "Since when do bears hunt in packs?" Jake raised the tranquilizer gun, but before he could fire, the larger bear did something that made everyone in the clearing freeze with shock. She stood up on her hind legs again, but this time, instead of roaring, she began to make a different sound entirely. She began to call. It was a long, melodious sound that carried through the forest like a song, rising and falling with notes that seemed to touch something deep in Luna's chest. It was beautiful and haunting and powerful, and Luna realized with amazement that the bear was calling for help. And from somewhere in the forest, other voices began to answer. First one, then another, then several more, until the morning air was filled with the calls of bears responding to their sister's plea. Luna had no idea there were so many bears in these woods, but apparently there were, and they were coming. Jake's face went white as the calls grew closer. "This is impossible," he whispered. "Bears don't do this. They don't communicate like this. They don't work together." But Luna was beginning to understand that these men knew very little about bears, really. They saw them as valuable objects to be captured and sold, not as intelligent, emotional creatures with their own complex social bonds and communication systems. They had no idea what they were really dealing with. The pregnant bear had stopped her advance and was now making her own calling sounds, adding her voice to her companion's song. And with each call, the answering voices grew closer and more numerous. "We need to get out of here," the man in the baseball cap said, backing toward the truck. "Now." But Jake was stubborn, or maybe just too angry to think clearly. "No," he snarled. "We're not losing this payday because of some kid and a bunch of wild animals. I don't care how many of them there are." He raised the tranquilizer gun again, aiming at the larger bear. But before he could pull the trigger, Luna did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She ran. Not away from the bears, but toward them. Her little legs carried her as fast as they could go, and she threw herself against the larger bear's massive front leg, wrapping her tiny arms around the thick fur and holding on tight. "Don't hurt them," she shouted, her voice stronger and clearer than it had ever been. "Don't hurt my friends." The bear looked down at her with an expression of such tenderness that Luna's heart almost burst. Then, with infinite gentleness, the massive creature lowered her head and nuzzled Luna's cheek with her enormous nose. It was like being kissed by a mountain, warm and soft and overwhelming in the best possible way. Jake hesitated, his finger on the trigger, clearly torn between his desire to complete his mission and his reluctance to accidentally harm a human child. But in that moment of hesitation, the forest around them exploded into motion. 5 more bears emerged from the trees, ranging in size from adolescents to massive adults, all of them moving with purpose toward the clearing. Their calls filled the air, and Luna realized with wonder that they weren't angry calls or threatening calls. They were greeting calls, welcoming back family members who had been lost. The 2 pregnant bears were not strangers to these woods. They were part of a community, a family that had been searching for them and was now overjoyed to have them back. Jake's hands were shaking as he looked around at the circle of bears that was steadily closing in on the three men. The animals weren't attacking, but their message was clear: leave now or face the consequences. "The truck," he whispered to his companions. Back to the truck, slowly. But as they began to retreat, Luna heard her mother's voice again, much closer now and tinged with the kind of panic that only a mother searching for a missing child can feel. "Luna! Oh God, Luna, where are you?" Iris crashed through the underbrush at the edge of the clearing at exactly the wrong moment. Her hair disheveled and her face streaked with tears and scratches from pushing through the thorny bushes. She took one look at the scene before her. Her tiny daughter surrounded by enormous bears, three strange men with weapons, and a tension in the air that spoke of violence barely held in check, and let out a scream that could have shattered glass. "Luna!" Everything happened at once after that. Iris ran toward her daughter without thinking, driven by pure maternal instinct. Jake spun toward her, the tranquilizer gun swinging in her direction. The bears, seeing a new human enter their protective circle and sensing the threat to both Luna and her mother, began to close ranks. And Luna, still clinging to her gentle giant's leg, looked up into those intelligent brown eyes and whispered, "Please help my mama, too." The bear's response was immediate and decisive. She let out a roar that shook the leaves on the trees, a sound of such power and authority that every other creature in the clearing, human and bear alike, froze where they stood. Then she began to move, and Luna, still holding onto her leg, found herself being carried forward as her enormous friend walked directly toward the men who had caused so much pain and suffering. But just as it seemed like the confrontation was about to reach its peak, Luna heard something that made her heart skip with hope and fear in equal measure. Sirens. Distant but growing closer, the unmistakable sound of police cars racing through the forest roads. Someone else had heard the commotion. Someone else was coming to help. Jake heard them too, and his face went from angry to desperate in an instant. He raised the tranquilizer gun one more time, but now he wasn't aiming at the bears. He was aiming at Luna. "If I can't have the bears," he said, his voice cold and terrible, "then nobody gets anything." The larger bear seemed to understand the threat instantly. She lifted Luna off the ground with her massive paw, cradling the tiny girl against her chest as gently as a human mother would hold her baby. Luna found herself pressed against the warmest, softest fur she had ever felt, listening to a heartbeat that was steady and strong and absolutely fearless. And from that position of perfect safety, she watched as 7 angry bears decided they had had quite enough of Jake and his friends. The pregnant bear moved first, despite her condition, lunging forward with a speed that defied belief. The other bears followed, and suddenly the 3 men found themselves facing not just animals, but a coordinated family unit that was prepared to protect one of their own by any means necessary. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger, but he never got the chance to fire. The bears were faster, smarter, and far more motivated than he had ever imagined possible. And as the sirens grew louder and Luna felt the steady heartbeat of her protector beneath her cheek, she knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the most impossible things can happen when love is stronger than fear. And sometimes the smallest person can change everything just by being brave enough to care. But what happened next defied everything Luna thought she knew about the world. Instead of attacking the men as everyone expected, the 7 bears suddenly stopped moving and arranged themselves in a perfect circle around Jake and his companions. They didn't growl or show their teeth. They didn't rear up on their hind legs or make threatening gestures. Instead, they sat down, like enormous dogs waiting for a command, and simply watched, The silence that followed was more terrifying than any roar could have been. Jake's hand was still shaking as he held the tranquilizer gun, but now he seemed frozen, unable to move in any direction. Everywhere he looked, intelligent brown eyes stared back at him with impatience that somehow felt more dangerous than rage would have been. Luna, still cradled safely against the larger bear's chest, could feel her protector's breathing slow and steady beneath her. It was as if the bear was deliberately calming herself, making a conscious choice to be gentle despite the threat to her adopted child. "What are they doing?" the short man whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why aren't they attacking?" Luna looked around at the circle of bears and suddenly understood. They weren't attacking because they didn't need to. They had already won. The men were surrounded, trapped not by violence but by the simple, overwhelming presence of creatures who had decided that enough was enough. Iris stood at the edge of the clearing, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she watched her tiny daughter being protected by a wild animal with more gentleness than some humans ever showed. She wanted to run forward, to snatch Luna away from the massive bear, but something in the scene held her back. Maybe it was the obvious care with which the bear was holding her child, or maybe it was the recognition that moving right now might disturb a balance that was keeping everyone safe. The sirens were getting closer, and Luna could now hear the sound of vehicles racing up the dirt road that led to the clearing. But there was something else, too, a new sound that made her lift her head from the bear's fur and listen more carefully. It was the sound of more engines, but these were different, heavier, and they were coming from the opposite direction. Jake heard them too, and his face went from pale to ashen. "The boss," he whispered. "He's coming himself." The man in the baseball cap was now visibly shaking. "We need to get out of here. If he finds us like this, if he sees what happened to the operation." But there was nowhere to go. The bears had them completely surrounded, and the sound of approaching vehicles was coming from both directions now. Whatever was about to happen, they were all trapped in this clearing together, waiting for forces beyond their control to arrive and decide their fate. Luna felt the bear beneath her tense slightly, and she looked up to see those intelligent eyes focused on something at the far edge of the clearing. Following her gaze, Luna saw movement in the trees, shadows that didn't quite match the pattern of the forest. More men were coming through the woods on foot, moving with the kind of careful stealth that spoke of military training or worse. These weren't bumbling criminals like Jake and his friends. These were professionals, and they were armed with more than tranquilizer guns. "Oh no," Iris whispered, finally understanding that whatever was happening here was much bigger and more dangerous than she had initially thought. But the bears had sensed the new arrivals too, and their response was immediate and coordinated in a way that left Luna breathless with amazement. Without any visible signal passing between them, 3 of the bears rose and melted back into the forest, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for creatures so large. The remaining 4 bears, including Luna's protector and the pregnant female, maintained their circle around Jake and his companions, but Luna could feel a new tension in the air, a sense of preparation for something much more serious than what they had been dealing with so far. Luna's protector made a soft sound deep in her throat, and suddenly Luna found herself being gently transferred to a new position. Instead of being cradled against the bear's chest, she was now seated on the massive creature's back, her tiny hands gripping the thick fur as the bear slowly stood to her full height. From this vantage point, Luna could see the entire clearing, and what she saw made her stomach clench with fear. The shadows in the trees were moving closer, and she could now make out the shapes of at least 6 men, all dressed in dark clothing and carrying weapons that looked far more serious than anything Jake had been wielding. But she could also see something else. The 3 bears who had disappeared into the forest were now positioned behind these new arrivals, invisible to the armed men but clearly visible to Luna from her elevated position. The bears weren't running away. They were setting up an ambush. "Jake?" A voice called out from the trees, harsh and commanding. "What's the situation? Why haven't you checked in?" Jake tried to call back, but his voice cracked on the first word. He cleared his throat and tried again. "We have complications, Mr. Volkov. The subjects escaped, and there are civilians involved." There was a pause, and then the voice came again, closer now and tinged with the kind of cold anger that made Luna press herself lower, against her protector's back. "Complications? I don't pay you to have complications, Jake. I pay you to deliver merchandise on schedule, with no questions asked and no witnesses left behind." Luna felt her protector's muscles tense beneath her, and she realized that the bear understood far more of what was being said than anyone suspected. These creatures weren't just intelligent, they were capable of understanding human speech, human intentions, and human threats. The pregnant bear made a soft huffing sound, and Luna's protector responded with an almost inaudible rumble. They were communicating, planning, preparing for whatever was about to happen. Iris, still standing at the edge of the clearing, was looking around frantically, trying to find some way to reach her daughter, or at least get her away from the escalating danger. But every direction she looked, there were either armed men or massive bears, and she had no idea which posed the greater threat to her child. Then the police sirens reached the dirt road, and Luna could hear vehicles skidding to a stop somewhere behind the trees. Car doors slammed, and authoritative voices began shouting orders, but they sounded far away and confused, as if the officers didn't quite know where to go or what they were dealing with. "This is getting out of hand," the man in the baseball cap muttered. "Too many people, too many variables. We should have cut our losses and run when we had the chance." But Jake seemed frozen, caught between his fear of the bears surrounding him and his terror of the man called Volkov, who was somewhere in the trees with his heavily armed team. Luna, from her perch on the bear's back, was beginning to understand the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about stealing 2 bears and selling them. This was about a much larger operation, something that involved dangerous people who had no qualms about hurting anyone who got in their way. And she was right in the middle of it, a tiny girl with a stuffed rabbit, protected by wild animals who had somehow decided she was worth risking their lives for. The first of Volkov's men emerged from the trees, and Luna's breath caught in her throat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with scars on his face and eyes that looked like they had never seen anything worth caring about. His weapon was military grade, and he carried it with the casual confidence of someone who had used it many times before. But as he stepped into the clearing and saw the scene before him, bears sitting calmly in a circle around 3 terrified criminals, a tiny child riding on the back of a massive wild animal, and a panicked mother standing helplessly nearby, his confident expression faltered. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his weapon swinging uncertainly between targets. Before Jake could answer, Luna's protector did something that changed everything. She turned her massive head to look directly at the armed man, and when she spoke, it wasn't with a roar or a growl. She spoke with a voice that was unmistakably, impossibly human. "You need to leave," the bear said, her words clear and precise, despite the obvious difficulty of forming them with a mouth not designed for human speech. "You need to leave now, and you need to never come back." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sounds of the forest seemed to stop as everyone in the clearing tried to process what they had just heard. Luna felt her world tilt on its axis. Bears couldn't talk. Everyone knew that. It was impossible, unthinkable. completely contrary to everything she had ever learned about the world. But she had heard it with her own ears, felt the vibrations of speech through the massive body beneath her. Her protector had spoken, and in doing so had revealed a secret that Luna somehow knew was far bigger than just one talking bear. Volkov's man was backing away, his weapon lowered, but his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. That's not possible," he whispered. But Luna was beginning to understand that impossible was just another word for something that hadn't happened yet. And in this forest, on this morning, with love and courage and desperate need all swirling together in the morning mist, impossible things were becoming possible with every passing moment. The pregnant bear rose slowly to her feet and looked at the armed man with eyes that held depths of intelligence and compassion that no one had expected to find in a wild animal. "We are not what you think we are," she said, her voice softer than her companion's, but just as clear. "And this child is under our protection. If you value your life, you will gather your men and leave this place immediately." Luna's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Everything she thought she knew about the world had just been turned upside down, and she was sitting in the middle of the most incredible, impossible, terrifying, and wonderful moment of her young life. But as more of Volkov's men emerged from the trees, their weapons trained on the talking bears, Luna realized that the real test was just beginning. Because now, it wasn't just about rescuing two trapped animals. Now, it was about protecting a secret that could change the world, if it survived the next few minutes. Volkov's men stood frozen in shock, their weapons trembling in hands that had faced down human enemies but had never encountered anything like this. The talking bears watched them with patient, intelligent eyes, waiting to see what choice the humans would make. Luna, still perched on her protector's back, looked around at the impossible scene surrounding her. Her tiny heart was full of wonder and terror in equal measure, but as she gazed into the kind eyes of the pregnant bear, she felt something settle deep in her chest. These weren't monsters or magical creatures from a fairy tale. They were mothers, just like her own mother, trying to protect their families in a world that didn't understand them. "Please," Luna whispered, so softly that only her protector could hear. "Please don't hurt anybody." The massive bear beneath her turned her great head slightly, and Luna felt rather than heard the gentle rumble of understanding. "We won't hurt anyone who doesn't try to hurt us first, little one. That has always been our way." Volkov himself finally stepped into the clearing, a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes that had seen too much of the world's darkness. But even his composure cracked when he saw the scene before him. His mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. This is impossible," he breathed. Luna's protector spoke again, her voice carrying an ancient dignity that seemed to echo from the very trees around them. "Many things seem impossible until they happen human. Your kind has spent so long believing you are the only thinking beings on this earth that you've forgotten to listen to the voices that were here long before you." The police sirens had stopped, and Luna could hear shouting in the distance as officers tried to find their way through the forest. But here in the clearing, time seemed suspended, balanced on the edge of a moment that would change everything. Iris, tears streaming down her face, took a tentative step forward. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please give me back my daughter. I don't care what you are or what secrets you're protecting, I just want my baby." The pregnant bear looked at Iris with infinite compassion. "Your daughter saved our lives," she said gently. "She freed us when we had no hope left. She showed us kindness when the world had shown us only cruelty. She is precious beyond measure." Luna felt herself being slowly, carefully lowered from her protector's back until her tiny feet touched the ground. The massive bear nuzzled her cheek one more time, a gesture so tender that it brought fresh tears to Iris's eyes. "Go to your mother, brave little one," her protector whispered. "But remember us. Remember that there is more magic in this world than your kind believes possible." Luna ran to her mother on unsteady legs, still clutching Coco to her chest. Iris swept her up in a fierce embrace, sobbing with relief and disbelief at everything she had witnessed. But as the police voices grew closer, something extraordinary happened. The bears began to fade back into the forest, not running but moving with a dignity and purpose that spoke of ancient wisdom. Even the two pregnant mothers, despite their condition, melted away into the trees as if they had never been there at all. Volkov and his men found themselves alone in the clearing with Jake and his companions, facing the approaching sound of law enforcement with no evidence of the miraculous events that had just unfolded. "Sir," one of Volkov's men said urgently, "we need to go. Now." But Volkov was staring at the spot where the bears had been, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been wonder. "Did you hear them speak?" he whispered. "Did they really?" "There's nothing here, sir," the man replied firmly. "Just some poachers with an empty cage. Nothing worth our time." Luna, safe in her mother's arms, watched the bad men disappear back into the forest as quickly as they had come. Jake and his friends were left standing alone, looking around in confusion as if they couldn't quite remember what had just happened. When the police finally burst into the clearing, they found only a mother holding her child, 3 confused men with poaching equipment, and an empty cage that told a story no one would ever fully believe. Officer Martinez, the first to arrive, looked around the scene with practiced eyes. "Ma'am, are you and your daughter all right? We got reports of some kind of disturbance." Iris nodded, holding Luna tighter. "We're fine, we got lost in the woods. These men had some animals trapped, but they seem to have escaped." The officer looked at the empty cage, then at Jake and his companions, who were mumbling incoherent explanations about bears and complications and lost merchandise. "We'll need to take statements from everyone," he said. "Illegal trapping is a serious offense." As the police began their investigation, Luna looked back toward the trees where her friends had disappeared. For just a moment, she thought she saw a flash of dark fur between the pines, and she could have sworn she heard a soft voice carried on the wind. "Thank you, little brave one. Thank you for showing us that not all humans have forgotten how to care." Luna smiled and waved her tiny hand toward the forest. "Bye-bye, Mama Bears," she whispered. Iris looked down at her daughter with eyes full of questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. "Luna, baby, what happened out here? What did you see?" Luna looked up at her mother with the solemn expression that sometimes crossed her young face when she was trying to explain something very important. "Mama bears were sad," she said simply. "So I helped them not be sad anymore." And as they walked back through the forest toward home, Luna clutching Coco and Iris holding her daughter close, neither of them spoke of the impossible things they had witnessed. Some secrets, they both understood, were too precious and too dangerous to share with a world that wasn't ready to believe. But every night for the rest of her life, Luna would dream of gentle giants with voices like whispered wisdom, and she would wake knowing that somewhere in the deep woods, families of extraordinary creatures lived their hidden lives in peace, protected by the silence of a little girl who had learned that the greatest magic happens when love is brave enough to act. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist hung heavy over Pine Ridge Valley, if you listened very carefully, you could still hear the soft sounds of ancient voices calling to each other through the trees, speaking of hope and kindness, and the memory of a tiny child who had changed everything by simply caring enough to help. The bears were free. The secret was safe. And Luna Hayes, all 19 months of her, had learned that sometimes the smallest person in the world can be exactly the right size to make the biggest difference of all. Years later, when Luna was grown and had children of her own, she would sometimes take them to the edge of Pine Ridge Valley and tell them stories about the magic that lived in the deep woods. And though her own children would laugh and say that bears couldn't really talk, Luna would just smile and remind them that the most important truths are often the ones that seem impossible at first. Because she knew something that the rest of the world had forgotten, that love and courage can unlock any cage, that kindness can bridge any gap between species, and that sometimes the most extraordinary things happen to the most ordinary people who are brave enough to listen to their hearts. And in the deep woods of Pine Ridge Valley, where the ancient trees kept their secrets and the morning mist held memories like treasures, the descendants of those two pregnant mother bears still lived and thrived, teaching their cubs the story of the tiny human child who had set them free. The story of Luna Hayes, who had proven that size doesn't matter when your heart is big enough to hold the whole world, and that sometimes the most shocking thing a baby can do is simply choose to care. The end.